So hi everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Eva and I'm a first year PhD student in history at the University of Sheffield. So my research looks at the historical formation of obsessive-compulsive disorder in British clinical psychology between 1950 and 1990. I focus particularly on how the conceptual components of OCD were constituted in relation to shifting ideas of psychological evidence and what this can tell us about psychological conceptions of the mind more broadly. So in this presentation today, I'm going to outline some of the decisions that were being made by psychologists in the 1970s in regards to the creation of OCD and the impact this has had in terms of the primacy of compulsive behaviours, particularly washing and checking, in wider perceptions of the disorder. So in the first 10 seconds, I'm going to mention harm intrusive thoughts. So if you want to mute me for about 10 seconds, then of course, feel free to do so. So in a collection of first-person narratives titled Taking Control of OCD and edited by the contemporary clinical psychologists David Veal and Rob Wilson, a contributor reflects on his experience of the disorder. The individual recounts having persistent thoughts of murdering someone he loved, which led him to hide the knives in his house and avoid all sharp objects. Reflecting on this experience, the author remarked, quote, "When I tried to explain what was going on to my girlfriend and later to my parents, I couldn't find any way of identifying what was happening to me." He admitted that, quote, "At the time, I thought OCD was all about triple checking you had locked the front door and that your hands were clean," end quote. When he visited a general practitioner, he was diagnosed with depression. The GP, remarked the author, focused on the visible effects of my distress, loss of appetite and disrupted sleep, rather than the cause. The obsessional thoughts were invisible. So this extract reflects two important features in the identification of OCD. Firstly, that obsessional thoughts are frequently rendered invisible, and the diagnosis of OCD occurs more readily in those with observable symptoms, something that's actually reflected in contemporary clinical literature. And secondly, that the stereotype of OCD is characterized by washing and checking behaviours. So this emphasis on visible behavioural tropes in OCD is perhaps most evident in media representations of the disorder, a critique which has been taken up by numerous cultural scholars. However, I want to suggest that the centrality of visible compulsions, predominantly acts of washing and checking, is actually central to the foundation of OCD itself. It can be traced back to a series of experimental studies conducted at the Department of Psychology at the Institute of Psychiatry in Maudsley Hospital between 1970 and 1976. So these studies were foundational in the creation of OCD as a psychological concept made up of invisible internal obsessions and visible behavioral compulsions. So prior to the 1970s, obsessions and compulsions were not clearly differentiated concepts, but were often used interchangeably and could be found in an array of psychiatric classifications. So for example, you have Freud's category of Zwangsneurose in the early 20th century, which was translated in Britain as obsessional neurosis and in America as compulsion neurosis. In British psychiatric textbooks throughout the 1940s and 50s, you also have things like obsessional melancholia, which is a form of psychosis, as well as compulsion disorders, which involved impulsive acts such as pyromania and kleptomania. Even clinical psychologists at the Maudsley in the 1960s were talking about the Freudian obsessional neurosis as made up of 3 obsessional behaviours. And these included things like exhibitionism, masturbation, and plucking of one's eyebrows. So symptoms which differ substantially from those contained in the differentiated concepts of obsessions and compulsions, which emerged throughout the 1970s. So the separation of obsessions and compulsions as 2 distinct concepts placed in a binary of thought and behaviour took place under the direction of the clinical psychologist Stanley Rachman. In a series of experiments conducted between 1970 and 1976 and published in the journal Behaviour, Research and Therapy, which is actually a journal established by the Maudsley Psychology Department in 1963, Rachman and his colleagues established a clear division between the symptoms of obsessional ruminations and compulsive rituals in psychiatric inpatients at the Maudsley diagnosed with the psychoanalytic category, obsessional neurosis. So the division between these components was established and strengthened through extensive experimental investigations of individuals who exhibited, quote, overt compulsive rituals and the active exclusion of obsessional ruminators. For example, in their study of 10 cases of obsessional neurosis in 1971, Rachman wrote that, quote, compulsions had to be present for entry into the trial and patients complaining of ruminations were excluded, a statement reiterated throughout the subsequent papers. In a single authored publication in 1971, Rachman gives us a sense of the rationale for the division of obsessional ruminations and compulsive rituals and the exclusion of the former from the departmental research program. The psychologist wrote that, quote, obsessional ruminators raise special problems for the clinical psychologist because of their subjective private nature, end quote. This, he argued, was in contrast with, quote, the other main feature of obsessional neurosis, compulsive behaviour, which can be approached with greater ease. It is visible, has a predictable quality, and many reproducible analogies in animal research, end quote. So as a consequence of this differentiation and exclusion, throughout this period, a stable model of compulsions as anxiety-reducing behaviours was developed, whilst ruminations were placed firmly outside the realm of psychological inquiry. So the idea that compulsive rituals were visible and thus worthy of attention, whilst ruminations were excluded, can be understood within the broader context of clinical psychology as it developed at the Institute of Psychiatry in the decades following the Second World War. As a new profession in Britain from 1948, central to carving out its unique contribution to post-war mental health services was the rhetorical separation of clinical psychology from both psychoanalysis and medical psychiatry by the head of the Maudsley Psychology Department, Hans Eysenck. So in contrast to these existing mental health professions, psychoanalysis and psychiatry, Eysenck insisted that clinical psychologists were unique. They were laboratory scientists who applied the scientific method directly into the clinical setting. So loosely rooted in a blend of 20th century logical empiricism and the operational methodology of US behaviorists, Eysenck's scientific method centered on observability. He insisted that true scientific knowledge was that which had an observable referent and could be rendered true or false through experimental means. As part of this empirical conception of science based on observability and its application to the clinical setting, Eysenck advocated a model of anxiety rooted in the behavior of animals and a therapeutic intervention which produced observable evidence of change. So it was these features that rendered compulsive rituals visible and obsessional ruminations invisible, and molded the development of compulsions as a distinct psychological symptom. It was argued that compulsions could be observed in animal behavior, and they could be visibly modified in experimental settings. These imperatives also framed the types of compulsions that were investigated in this period: washing and checking behaviors. So, unsurprisingly, the entirety of the studies on compulsive rituals conducted by Rachman et al. In the early 1970s were underpinned by a selection of experimental analogues of repetitive behavior in animals. I'm not going to go into too much detail about these experiments, as the importance of kind of animal analogies in making compulsive rituals visible is a whole other paper with a lot of other implications. But what is significant is that in an initial study in 1970, Rachman stated that an experiment on rats in 1949, conducted by the American psychologist Norman Maier, had illustrated a theory of compulsions as, quote, anxiety-reducing behaviours, end quote, and a technique, quote, which had proved successful in overcoming compulsive behaviour in animals, end quote, and that this should now be applied to the clinic. Essentially, Maier's experiment has shown that if you expose a rat to something that it feared, for example, he uses an electric shock, it engaged in fixated behaviour, such as jumping, which is what happened in his experiment, which, Mayer argued, reduced the anxiety associated with the original shock. So the jumping reduced the anxiety associated with the original shock. If, however, you exposed the rat to what it feared and prevented it from jumping, then it became less scared. So this experiment was underpinned by a stimulus response model of learning, which assumed that the behavior of all organisms developed through an interaction with environmental stimuli, and that maladaptive behavior, such as the repetitive jumping of the rats, became pathological through reinforcement. Rachman remarked that the fixated jumping of rats in Mayer's study was reminiscent of compulsive behavior. He hypothesized that, like the rats, compulsive behavior in humans was performed to reduce anxiety, and through this process became repetitive. So the experiments in the 1970s were based around testing this hypothesis, derived from animal models, that compulsions were anxiety-reducing behaviors, which could be, quote, made extinct through exposing individuals to what they feared and preventing them from carrying out their pathological behavioral responses. So some of you may recognize this as exposure response prevention. And the subjects chosen for these experiments were those that fit the demand of this experimental situation, so to test the hypothesis. Not only did this criterion exclude patients with ruminations, I mean, the thoughts of rats aren't easily accessible, it also meant that the appendix list in the studies on obsessional neurosis in 1970, 1971, and 1972 entirely consisted of individuals with behavioral washing rituals linked with contamination fears. The exclusive focus on washing behaviours is justified by Rachman not on conceptual grounds, but for pragmatic reasons. He asserts that, quote, the necessity to provoke the urge to carry out compulsive rituals in an experimental setting proved easy to accomplish in patients with cleaning rituals based on fears of contamination, end quote. So an example case study in 1971 involved a patient with a fear of contamination from animals and excessive washing rituals. The experiment involved getting the individual to create a hierarchy of objects she considered to be contaminated, consisting of mud, a guinea pig, and dog excrement, and then touching these items. After each touching action, the individual was prevented from washing her hands for increased lengths of time. So as with Mayer's study of rats, the intention was to disrupt the pathological reinforcement connection between the stimulus, the contaminated object, and the response, the washing, thus making the repetitive behavior extinct. So it's important to make clear that this fear of contamination was not conceptualized at this point as a rumination or as a thought. The psychologists simply refer to it as an internal stimulus, so the equivalent of an electric shock or like a danger signal, producing a maladaptive motor response. The therapeutic effectiveness of each of these experimental procedures was accounted for by measuring the reduction of visible behavior. And this actually indicates a specific idea of therapeutics, which, rather than involving psychic exploration, as had dominated in understandings of obsessional neurosis, equated successful therapeutic outcomes with a measurable reduction in visible pathological behavior. And again, this process and the demands of this kind of observable reduction in behavior was easier to determine in those with visible washing actions than with individuals with kind of more complex and less easily defined symptoms. So in the case example above, the individual had to record how many times she engaged in washing behavior outside of the experimental situation and report back. And this was supplemented with an avoidance test in which the proximity to which she could place herself in relation to each contaminated object was measured before and after the touching had taken place. They also used a fear thermometer where she rated from 1 to 10 how she felt about certain actions, such as touching the guinea pig. Rachman wrote that the woman was discharged when there had been a, quote, significant decrease in her washing behavior, and it was no longer considered unduly excessive. She could also place herself in close proximity with the contaminated objects and refrain from washing her hands for what Rachman decided to be an adequate amount of time. So it was argued that these initial studies on psychiatric inpatients at the Maudsley with clear washing behaviours provided initial evidence for the hypothesis derived from animal models that compulsive rituals were in fact anxiety-reducing behaviours, which could be therapeutically modified through behavioural exposure. The subsequent major experiments in the first half of the 1970s focused on checking behaviour, which was subsumed under the category of compulsions. Rachman et al. Used the same model devised in regards to ritualistic washing, but applied it to a different but equally observable symptom. So in 1973, Rachman and John Roper remarked that their theory of compulsive behaviours needed to be confirmed in relation to those who, quote, display clear checking rituals, end quote. That the psychologists chose again to focus on patients at the Maudsley with clearly pronounced symptoms demonstrates how compulsions in this period were being formed as a concept around a distinct set of visible behaviours. And the experiments on checking behaviours, which were associated, with the fears of leaving the door unlocked or the gas on, followed the same procedure as the studies on washing rituals that had taken place earlier. Patients were placed under a series of experimental conditions, for example, being told the cooker had been left on, whilst their urge to check was monitored and prevented. The level of anxiety and how it changed both before and after the experimental treatment was accounted for through the same fear thermometer used with washers. So this study on compulsive checkers was again replicated in 1975 with more participants in order to smooth out some of the anomalies from the initial experiment. So you can kind of see in this period how a generalized theory around compulsive behavior was being formed through testing a single model which derived from animal studies, two symptoms grouped by the presence of observable behaviours. And this process led to a standardization of the concept of compulsions as two types of patients, washers and checkers. And it's important to emphasize that in none of the discussions of these experiments, in their published form anyway, is the context of the provoking situation explained or elucidated. The point was not to gain insight into the contextual narratives of fear, but to create a general theory of compulsions as a functional behavior which served to reduce and thus reinforce states of conditioned anxiety. So the majority of the experimental work conducted in the early to mid-1970s informed the creation of a new diagnostic instrument for the identification of compulsions. This was the first version of the Maudsley Obsessive-Compulsive Inventory in 1977. So whilst this inventory was described as, quote, an instrument for assessing the existence and extent of different types of obsessional compulsive complaints, end quote, and it did include questions around obsessional slowness and doubting, Rachman and Ray Hodgson remarked that the inventory focused predominantly on, quote, two major types of complaint, checking and washing compulsions. The psychologists also admitted that the research behind the inventory stemmed from a study involving participants who, quote, exhibited observable rituals and were not ruminators, end quote. So the inventory consisted of a set of questions with a true-false format. Obsessional compulsive complaints was a diagnosis attached to individuals who fulfilled a defined quota of true and false answers. So at the same time as measuring the existence of compulsive symptoms, inventories like this reduce and crystallize the concept of compulsions. As André Castel has remarked in regards to the creation of the YBOC in 1980, such inventories, quote, extract abstract narrative segments from complex scenarios of obsessions, such as fears of catching a deadly disease, into questions around the extent of particular behaviours. So in their 1980 publication, Obsessions and Compulsions, Rachman and Hodgson wrote that, quote, compulsions are repetitive stereotyped acts, and the two major types of compulsive activity are cleaning and checking, end quote. They state that, quote, the classic example of the former type is the compulsive hand washer, and the common example of the second type is the person who compulsively checks the security of appliances in his or her home, end quote. there is no recognition by the authors of their role in constituting these classic examples of compulsive behaviour, which are given the status of being trans-historical. So to conclude, the concepts of obsessions and compulsions as two distinct symptoms based in a binary of visible and invisible has had significant implications. I want to suggest that the decision by Rachman and his colleagues in the early 1970s to designate non-observable behaviours as outside the realm of initial inquiry and solely investigate individuals with clearly pronounced washing and checking behaviours has facilitated the primacy of observable compulsions, predominantly acts of washing and checking, as the archetypal characteristics of OCD. So when obsessional ruminations were returned to as a topic of conversation, as a topic of research in the late 1970s, they were initially made visible through the behavioural model of compulsions already established. So you have psychologists talking about things like the internal putting matters right as the exact equivalent of compulsive hand washing. So whilst this process and this concept shifts with the integration of cognitive behavioral models and interventions in the 1980s and the development of ideas around intrusive thoughts, which are obviously extremely significant, the distinction between visible behavioral compulsions and internal mental obsessions has continued to characterize perceptions of OCD in cultural and non-specialist clinical domains.